I feel like we all have really great backgrounds now that I'm looking at it. I mean, mine is just my made bed,
no.
but
I am like perfectly situated so that you cannot see the giant junk pile behind me.
strategic sitting. I like it.
Yes,
I like it.
yes. Yeah. It was
Yeah, I have
like,
this
ooh,
one window.
I could clean off the pile, or I could just sit in the right way so you don't see it.
Work smarter, not harder, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Is anybody getting any feedback on their end? I feel like I'm getting like an echo on my end. It's just me. Lucky me. That's okay. Maybe we'll figure it out. How funny. I'm going to mute myself just for a second just to see. Hi, everybody that's joining us. You came right in during my issues with technology. I think what I'll do is I'll mute myself when everybody else is talking, because what I'm hearing right now is my own voice in my headphones from like 2 minutes ago.
Oh,
So
no.
we'll see how that goes. But in the meantime, I want to welcome everybody to what is actually our March TikTok for Boobies and Noobies, but we are celebrating it today on April 1st. It is not an April Fool's Day joke. It is us here in person. And today I'm super excited because rom-coms are something that are so near to my heart, as well as just adaptations that I think are circling the world of romance right now. And I'm loving every second of it. So that's what we're talking about today, is stories that make for the best adaptations for romance, as well as the stories that inspire us, that we maybe want to see more of in romance. So I'm going to go ahead and let all of the panelists introduce themselves. So I'm just going to kick it over to Alison because you're on my side first. So over to you, Alison.
Hello, I'm Alison Cochrun. I am a queer romance author. So my debut novel was called The Charm Offensive. And then my second novel, Kiss Her Once for Me, came out last November.
All right. I'm Livy Hart. My debut novel was Talk Flirty to Me, and I have a book coming out in May called Planes, Trains, and All the Feels.
Yes.
And I'm Allie Parker, and I run the podcast Romance Ever After and am chaos maven for the rom-com bracket.
Yes, which I will 100% want to talk about more later. So we will come back to that. But I guess first things first, I always want to know from everybody, whether they're a reader, writer, podcaster, whoever, just sort of how their romance journey began. So as a reader, writer, etc., when did it all begin for you? And I'll just throw it back over to Alison, but feel free to jump in and answer anytime.
Yeah, for me, I think I've just like always really been fascinated by love stories. Like my memories of, I don't know if it was like Disney indoctrination, but I like remember always caring like way too much about the love stories in Disney movies as a kid, even though like they were terrible in the 90s. So I don't know what I was thinking. But like my first really like salient memory of romance is that my dad like loves rom-coms, like, and he loves like Nora Ephron films. And so I used to watch like While You Were Sleeping and Sleepless in Seattle, like with him, like on VHS.
I love that.
Yeah. And so we used to always watch them together, and like as a 10-year-old. So like as a 10-year-old, Sleepless in Seattle was like my favorite movie. So that was super normal. But yeah, I think that's my earliest kind of introduction to the romance genre.
Yeah, definitely to piggyback off that, I remember being way too young to watch the things I was watching, and caring way too much about the 3 seconds of screen time for the love story and those like action movies that other people would be watching. I'm like, why are we spending so much time on the high-speed car chase when there are two people who need to kiss? And just all those like awarenesses of the love that was happening on screen and stuff. And I just remember being a person who definitely was like making the gummy bears kiss as a kid and like being like giggly about it. And but I actually didn't read a lot of romance until right before the pandemic. I was reading all kinds of other things. And then the Gospel of Christina Lauren fell into my hands. And I remember saying to someone, like, I didn't know books could be like this. I didn't know you were allowed to have fun with books. I thought there needed to be like excessive pain at all times. And so it was just really exciting. It was like a very marked moment of like, oh, okay, what if we had fun and told those stories too? Not that there isn't room for all the complex feelings, but just the calm of the rom, right? Like that really appealed to me.
So for me, I talk a little bit about this in the Black Love Matters book that was put out by Jessica Pride last year. For me, I started, watching a lot of movies, rom-coms with family like everybody else. My mom was a big movie watcher, so we always watched movies together. And I realized I really loved romance because, just like you, Livy, like those 2 seconds of kissing, that was the most important part to me, right? I didn't start reading romance specifically until maybe I was about 13. I got my hands on a floating copy of Bridget Jones in the house, and I read that, and I was like, oh, this is good, but I want more of the stuff where she's actually happy and not pratfalling all over the place. Yeah. And I fell into reading categories. I think I started reading some Harlequin categories, and then I was like, oh yeah, this is good stuff. And it was just like me just trying to find as much of that as possible. I was like taking some of my lunch money every week to go on Tuesday, book release day, to the Borders on the way home to like buy whatever book I could. And like that was just kind of like the beginning of my love affair with romance, and hasn't left me yet.
I love that. Thank you all for sharing a little bit about yourselves and your romance reading journeys. I hate to be that person, but I am going to say that there's something going on audio-wise on my end. I'm 100% confident that it's just me that's having an issue. But I think the best thing that I can probably do is just restart and come back on. So I apologize if that's going to like end the stream momentarily for us to like come back, but I don't know what else to do. I've tried changing my microphone and my headphones. So I'm going to leave and come back, and that will probably kick the three of you. I'm not sure, but everybody please stick around because I promise we will be right back.
I'm still here. You're still here.
Same. Yeah.
Hello, public.
Yeah. I love the color of your walls, Allie. I'm obsessed with it. Like,
thank you. I am deeply obsessed with teal too.
I can't hear anybody. 1 second. Audio. Okay, I think I've got it.
Is it okay? We just ended up staying.
I've got you. Good. I've got you. Okay, great. I think we're still live. How funny. I love it. It's so funny. I don't know what was going on, but it was like I was hearing like stereo of everyone. And I was like, well, this isn't a club. Otherwise, I would really appreciate this. But okay, it sounds clean now, though technology has been conquered once again. So no, I love that everybody has their own introduction to romance. I mean, I love Allie mentioned Bridget Jones' Diary. And I too, like Alison, kind of grew up on While You Were Sleeping and Sleepless in Seattle. Ironically, also my dad being the one to kind of introduce me to those movies. Like I love it. My dad is definitely like the rom-com like sappy one in the family, although he would never admit it. He would never say that, but 100%. So I love that. I love that there's so many things that we have in common when it comes to this. And I think that's true for a lot of the romance community. So just goes to show we have so much in common. But when talking about adaptations and retellings and reimaginings of, whether it's a Shakespearean classic or, our favorite 90s flicks. What kinds of stories do you think make for the best kind of source material to like draw inspiration from?
That's a great question. I think for me, the ones that I find that are the most that have the best adaptations are the ones where the the beats of it are so like crystal clear that no matter how you transform the story, people immediately latch onto it. Like I think it's called All Stirred Up. It's a retelling of Persuasion. And I didn't know it was going to be a retelling of Persuasion. I honestly just picked up the audiobook because Mary Jane Wells narrated it, and I will listen to anything she narrates. She could read me the phone book. And I was listening to it, and then like about halfway through, I went, oh, this is Persuasion, because like, you know, it had like the beats of them coming back, her family being batty and spending all their money, and her, you know, being the dependable one, and you know, the reuniting with her love interest who's kind of mad at her, and you know, the meddling aunt figure, like oh yeah, these are things that everybody kind of remembers about Persuasion. They don't necessarily remember everything, but they remember like the big stuff. And so when the big stuff is like just really sticks with you, I think those are like the best stories to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about when there's one element that is so intensely related to one movie, like 13 Going on 30. Once you have that one piece of woke up, was 30 or whatever, that's all you need. And then everything else you do from there can be, you know, your own magic to it. And that's kind of what sticks out for me. And sometimes, like you were saying, it's sneaky. You don't always even realize it's a retelling. And then that one thing hits. And since every romance is, you know, between those two core people, I think it's really magic when those side relationships come into play, because then you can sometimes start to see, oh, a meddling aunt. Oh, okay. Now that's kind of cluing you in as to what they're trying to do. And so, yeah, I would say definitely those big moments that sort of belong to one movie and make them iconic. That's what I like to look for.
Yeah, I like that. I guess for me, like, I like the way, Allie, you explained it so well, that like it's stories that have those really clear beats, or like old stories that have tropes that we like use, you know, like Jane Austen works so well at adaptations because those are the tropes we see in romance already. And so the way that like you can play around with those stories is really fun. But for me, when it comes to retellings, like I'm just drawn to any story that I kind of just am like, but what if it was gay? Like, so I just want to like take stories that I love. I just want to take like stories that I really love and be like, okay, but like, how would this classic like heteronormative love story be different if it were queer instead? And that's what like draws me as both a reader and a writer.
I love that. When I lived in LA and I was still trying to do like the screenwriting game, I feel like that's kind of the way, and I'm sure a lot of this applies to the world of publishing as well, but that's how you would want to pitch a story idea or a script, is like, oh, it's Groundhog's Day, but make it gay. It's, you know, this, but it has you know, it's role reversal. Now it's like the woman pursuing the man, you know? And so I do think having those moments that people can relate to and like reference, because when you hear Groundhog's Day, you know, oh, it's time repeating over and over again. 13 Going on 30. It's her waking up. Freaky Friday. Body swap. Like, I mean, it's all these like iconic beats and moments that people, if you just mention the title, can automatically relate to. And I know I just named movies, but I think a lot of Jane Austen and Shakespeare plays also have those moments that people know, oh, this is a, you know, Romeo and Juliet story. Not as much of a rom-com, but it could be in the world of romance.
Yeah, and go ahead, Livy.
No, I was just gonna say, but what if?
You know, but I think that's the temptation to, like, especially with Jane Austen and Shakespeare, to modernize it, to right those wrongs that we read. Like, there are moments we love in everything, but like, especially to a modern reader, you see those like glaring things that like stick in your craw, and you're like, ooh, but what if I did this? But I did it better, and I don't like, I don't blame, the woman for this, or I don't, or I don't mistreat side characters. I rectify all of these glaring issues so I can actually truly love the story the way it needs to be loved.
I'm so glad you said that, Allie, because I think that is so true, that a lot of the times when writers decide to adapt a story, that I want to right the wrongs of how the story was told. I want to write Romeo and Juliet, but what if they had a conversation and didn't, unalive themselves? What if they, and I do think there's a lot of that when it does come to retellings, is how can I, one, put my stamp on this, but two, give the characters the ending that they deserved and maybe didn't get before, which I think is kind of what leads into the world of fan fiction, is this idea that like, I want to create these relationships and write stories for the characters that I think were done some kind of injustice. That's it. That's all I had to say about fan fiction.
I wish more about fan fiction, though, if we need to.
Yeah, I mean, we can pivot. We can pivot.
It's so funny though, because like I don't know enough about fan fiction. I know a lot of people do get started reading and writing romance when it comes to fan fiction. That wasn't my route, so I don't have more to say about it. I do think it's like very commendable, the people who do write it. So
yeah,
I think oh, go ahead.
No.
I was just going to say, actually, what we're really talking about is kind of fan fiction. We just don't use the exact same names, and we are making substantial changes, but they do that in fanfic as well. Like, I wouldn't have called myself a fanfic writer, but I was busting out some Twilight fanfic. Not even. So I think you're a fan of not necessarily a specific character, but maybe of a trope, and you're like, I'm going to do this until I find a story there for myself. But I think when you're so inspired by something that you have to take action, like that's just fan fiction, no matter what you do with it. I saw Easy A, which is probably one of my favorite retellings. Oh my gosh, I could talk about it all day. And I have never been more inspired. I was like, oh my gosh, they didn't even have to change too much. They didn't have to, because modernizing it was enough of the change, because of how our attitudes about sex have changed and all these other things. And they even
haven't changed.
They have not changed enough. And so I just thought that was so brilliant. And so, yeah, it's just, you get inspired and you're like, I can do this. Like Allie was saying, I can make this, but I can make it better. I can make it safer for readers. I can make it all these things. So,
yeah. Allie, did you have more you wanted to add? I feel like you were going to say something before too.
I'm a golden retriever, so it's like,
it'll come back to you when the moment is right. I should have also mentioned this at the beginning for everybody watching, that Nisha Sharma was supposed to be joining us, but she had a family emergency, so she won't be here. But I did just want to, for a second, promo her books, because her If Shakespeare Was an Anti-Trilogy is so fantastic. Dating Dr. Dill was actually a book we reviewed on Boobies and Noobies for the podcast, and had such a fun time reading. And I know that the second book is coming out later this year. I have an arc of it on my Kindle that I'm like, you have things you need to read before this, Kelly, but also I want to read it now. But her trilogy is inspired by Shakespeare's comedies. So if people haven't had a chance to read Dating Dr. Dill yet, highly recommend. It was probably one of my favorite reads of last year. So we love you, Nisha. But moving on. And now, as we've already talked about, it's not only a book sometimes, or a play when it comes to Shakespeare, that inspires an adaptation or a retelling. Sometimes it's a 80s road trip movie. Sometimes it's a 90s rom-com. So I'd love to turn this next question to Alison specifically, whose sapphic holiday romance, Kiss Her Once for Me, was inspired by the 1995 rom-com While You Were Sleeping. What about this movie in particular inspired you to write the book, Alison?
I wish I had like a profound answer to that. But the truth is like pretty embarrassing. So I like had just sold my first book to a publisher, and we were like, you know, in that phase of like my editor was going to be doing revision notes and all of that. So we were just waiting, and my agent was like, all right, like book 2 ideas. What do you got? And I had nothing. Like, I don't know. It was June of 2020, and we were like in a horrible part of the pandemic where I was only talking to my sister and my dog, and I just like had no creative thoughts in my head. And so I was like trying to come up with like ideas. And I think I made a list of like, but make it gays, where I was like coming up with like all of these different like movies and books that I could play around with and turn into like sapphic stories. And I thought about while you were sleeping, and I settled on it because I like firmly believe that Bill Pullman in that movie like looks like a Portland lesbian, like 100%. In just like the best way. And so I was like, oh my gosh, like that's so like such a natural adaptation, because like he has like the floppy hair and like the flannel with a Carhartt on over, and just like stomping around in some work boots, and like
and
it's
he
just,
makes furniture.
I know, it's so lesbian.
He's crafty.
It's so good. And so like that was it. I was just like, oh yeah, like Bill Pullman. Like this explains so much about me and my crush on Bill Pullman growing up. Like it's because like he straight up looks like a lesbian in that movie, like a super hot lesbian. So that was it. Like that was kind of what sealed the deal for me. And I started playing around with that concept.
I mean, I love that. And I especially love that you left the character's name as Jack in the book, because I will say this is something, maybe it's just a personal thing. This is something that really annoys me, is when I do see a movie or I read a book and it's clearly an adaptation, but there's been some kind of gender swap that they change the name. And I personally would love the name to stay the same. Like just because I love being able to know that this is coming from that source material, and it kind of makes me look at the original in like a different way. If I have like that same name for context. But yeah, I especially with all the names that we have today that are so unique and really not relegated to one gender, I would like to see more of that.
Yeah, I just thought it was hot. I just thought like a woman named Jack would be hot. So I was like, yeah, that's perfect. Like I'll change everybody else's names, but like she will still be Jack.
Yeah, we knew with Bill Pullman.
Yeah,
there it is.
Absolutely.
Well, and then over to Livy, because when I first received word about your upcoming rom-com Planes, Trains, and All the Feels, my eye immediately jumped to a romantic update on the classic John Hughes penned comedy. And I immediately was thinking, oh, I wonder if this was inspired by a particular John Hughes film or just John Hughes all around. So what do you think?
You know, it was so many different things that came together at the same time, kind of what you were saying, Alison, about, you're sitting down to write a book. So in this situation, it was not my first book. So there's that difference between walking up with something in your hand saying, this was born of me, here you go, and then coming up with it with a team and all those other elements that sort of impact it. But I know that one thing that was really, really, that compelled me was I wanted something that wasn't a romance, but felt like it could be. And I wanted in this situation to take what is a road trip book, but not entirely. And it was just like all these almosts, like, and bring them all together. And I mean, I wish it's like Steve, like with so many things, I'm like, this would be better if those characters were gay, but like if you're in a movie, I always say Steve and John, because that's who they are to me. I know that their characters have different names, but it's Steve Martin and John Candy. Like we're gonna say their names, right? But it was such a beautiful story of friendship, and it was so many other things that, made it just really interesting to try to adapt. But more than that, more than anything else, I am an agent of chaos, first, foremost, and always. In order to be true to myself, I was like, whatever we do with this, it has to be absolutely chaotic. And I think it is, hopefully in a good way. But So yeah, just taking all these different, like what could be obstacles, but also, you know, exciting things like, well, how do you take something that is so beautiful and perfect and friendship based and, you know, all these things, but still honor it and still do it justice, but also make it a romance and also make it something that people who maybe don't even have any, you know, tie to the original would enjoy. So yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question because again, agent of chaos, but I just remember thinking the whole time, this doesn't have to change the original. The original is so perfect. I'm just going to take the pieces I love the most and just play with them. And that was, you know, explosions and things.
I know, but I think that's important to note too. It's you're not necessarily like seeking to rewrite Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Like you're not seeking to like redo it because it's already great. But it's what, like you said earlier, what if this was also, you know, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, but with romance? And I, for one, I know it's not a John Hughes movie, but I also was channeling the movie The Sure Thing, which is like another road trip romance movie of the 80s. And so in my mind, it was like a culmination of the two that made me very happy. So
I love that.
yeah, I love that. Well, and then Miss Allie, who has a podcast dedicated to romance and rom-coms, Romance Ever After. I would love, first of all, if you could talk about the rom-com bracket, because some of the movies that we've even mentioned just in this discussion have appeared in and even won the rom-com bracket.
Yeah, so the rom-com bracket happens every February. Kick it off on Valentine's Day. It was founded by one Miss Bianca Hernandez Knight. She is a historical costume recreator. She's an Austinite. She runs the Jane Con. That happens every year, which is a free conference for people interested in Jane Austen. I think they're still taking pitches for panels right now, so you might want to reach out for that. And I have been helping her out with it for the last couple of years, and she was like, hey, do you want to take it over? And so this was my first year doing it. Basically, it is just February madness for rom-coms. Everybody gets to nominate movies that they think should go on the bracket, and then I, like a chaos agent, seed those movies into different categories. And you know, it is just daily polls of people voting for their favorite movies. And if Muskrat is killing polls for people who don't pay, we will be finding a new home. Do not worry. We will be finding a new home, probably Tumblr, which is where it'll get even crazier. But basically, you know, they're just voting every day for the movies that they want to win. And since, you know, it's not a sporting event, the only way that we can spur people on is by yelling at each other online all day long.
Great.
And this year, since it was my first year, I went bigger and better. So we did 128 movies. It's normally like 64. And that was a lot. It was a lot. And a lot of people were both angry and happy about it. But I think it was like a fun 10 days. A little stressful for me, but it was a fun 10 days.
Yeah. And I believe the one that took it all home this year was While You Were Sleeping.
Yeah.
That makes
Rightfully
sense.
so.
I approve.
Look, it was time for it to fight its way back, because 2 years ago, somebody told Kevin Smith that Chasing Amy was in the poll, and it was voting for it the day that it was up against While You Were Sleeping. And he told all his little minions on the interwebs, I go vote for Chasing Amy. And oh my God, just threw the poll well out of whack. People were
Thanks a heap, Kevin Smith.
Very salty. Very salty. So it was its
redemption.
Time.
Yes,
yeah, it was
absolutely.
Time.
Well, and I'm curious, you know, as somebody who talks about rom-coms regularly and watches them for the podcast, are there any connections or realizations that you've made sort of about the romance genre as a whole from all of that?
Yeah. So one of the things we do in the podcast is after we've talked about the movie, I always ask the person, if this were to be a romance book, is there anything that you would change about it? Is there anything that you would do to make it like actual genre romance? And one of the biggest things we always know is that a lot of the times when it comes to the movies, what's selling the romance is the way the characters are looking at each other. A lot of the heavy lifting is done by the actors themselves. So it's finding those ways to internalize those actions to make it more visceral on the page for the reader, because, we get, when we see it happening, we get that, like, we get the visual cues of this is how you're supposed to be feeling right now. And so what's masterful about writers is finding the ways of making you feel that when it's on the page. And like that's always the most difficult part. Yeah, so I think that's like kind of the biggest thing.
Yeah, I think that you nailed it for sure, because, again, as somebody who kind of got started more with screenwriting than with book writing, I do think you are counting on the actors to really present well, and not just the actors, you're counting on the music, you're counting on the cinematography. Like there are so many components that go into it to hopefully elicit some sort of emotional connection. But when you're writing a book, you just have the words on the page. That's all you get. So you're doing the heavy lifting. You're doing all the work of all those people in one to again, hopefully elicit some kind of emotional reaction from the reader. So yeah, an extra challenge indeed. So that's so interesting though. Do you have a favorite rom-com that you've covered for the podcast that you and your guests have like agreed on would make like an excellent romance novel?
Oh God. So
I'm
many
sure there's
movies.
a million, but I'm putting you on the spot, of course.
Yeah. And like you're asking me to rely on my memory. Thanks.
Oh, that's right. We just had the golden retriever moment. I forgot.
I mean, I would personally like to have redo Only You, but do it from the perspective of her sister-in-law.
Only You. I don't even know if I know that one.
So that stars Marissa Tomei and Robert Downey Jr. And Bonnie Hunt is in it as well. She plays the sister-in-law. And the thing is, Marissa Tomei's character is like, she's very much a romantic, and she believes in fate and all that stuff. And what happens is when she's younger, she and her brother are playing with a Ouija board, and it tells her the name of her soulmate. And she goes and gets it reinforced also by a fortune teller at a carnival. And 15, 20 years later, she's engaged to this guy whose name is not that name. And she's having sort of second thoughts, because he's very much he's a podiatrist, so he's like very much a stick in the mud. And she's still like flights of fanciful person. And while she's trying on this hideous wedding dress that is her fiance's mother's wedding dress, she gets a phone call, and it's the guy with the name who is supposed to be her soulmate. And she's like, oh my God, where are you? And because it's 1995, he's at the airport. She can run in to the airport without a ticket. Right. She decides she just narrowly misses him. So she decides to chase him all the way to Italy. And her sister-in-law comes along with her. Her sister-in-law, who is greatly unfulfilled by her relationship with her husband. So if I had to do a movie into a book, I would love to do Only You, but I would like to do it from the perspective of the sister-in-law, because I feel like she gets screwed over in the end.
Yeah. I like that. I think that'd be fun. Well, and it kind of reminds me of when I'm thinking about Kiss Her Once for Me, that Alison constructed this side romance that's also going on. I mean, it kind of ingrains itself and becomes like a love square as well in the story. But I don't think there's anything wrong with having multiple romances in a story as well.
Yeah. I mean, so often, the side characters become our favorite characters. And
Very
I
true.
love seeing the character fall in love on the page too.
Yeah. So that's a question I think too for Alison and Livy is if as authors who have, kind of adapted or been inspired by these stories and gone on to write your own, has there been any moments of maybe creating new characters or having readers want to see more of characters that you've created to get their own book and then going at that point you're already going beyond the original source material to then kind of dive into a completely different story?
Do you want to go first?
No, you take it away.
I have a lot of thoughts. No, so one thing for me that I really enjoy and that fulfills me in writing is writing big casts of characters. So I already knew coming into this that it was going to be very challenging and it was going to be a new experience to really pare it down, because that's the double-edged sword. You have two people, like planes, trains, and automobiles was these two people pretty much the whole time. So having them on screen or on page together. So I really at first struggled, but then enjoyed finding ways to tie in these other people. And in the book, they're both on their way somewhere important because there's that urgency of we have to get there. So that right there was, okay, well, where are they going and why is it important to them and how all these things. But the two characters who I am thinking of are their best friends. And my favorite scene in the whole book is towards the beginning when they're trying to decide if they're going to share this last rental car in the airport. My main character, Cassidy, FaceTimes her best friend for like, hey, you have to see his face because I need to make sure that if I get, disappeared, you have a face to match to it. So it becomes a FaceTime scene between her best friend, and the guy. Well, then the guy gets his best friend on FaceTime and says, well, now you have to vouch for me because they don't believe that I'm not a serial killer. And it becomes FaceTime. And so moments like that of bringing in other people was really fun and important. And that definitely wasn't something that I got from the original. But now the question I get the most from the book is, are these two side characters going to have their own story because they deeply, deeply did not get along immediately, forcefully for the entirety of their time on page? And what is love if not hate fixing itself? So yeah, so that's definitely the question I get the most is, how can we get a story for them? And I'm like, I would love to write them. I already know what they're going to do. So we'll see what I can do with them.
Well, there you go.
That's exciting.
Okay. Yes, I love that. And that's so gratifying, so rewarding to be someone, like, to get that message of I enjoyed these people and I want their story. Like, that's truly the dream. Like, that's what you want, is to make somebody feel something enough to want another story. Like, I just feel so grateful for that.
Alison, I'm sure you have something to add as well, but I did just have a quick follow-up, Livy, and that is, do you feel like then, is there any sort of obligation to then create another story inspired by another John Hughes classic to like kind of stay in the same sphere? Or is it just like we pull all the way away from that with the new story?
I didn't think of that. Now I'm gonna think of that though, because
no!
I love it.
Okay.
I say I know what I want them to do. I know that I want them to fall in love. So let's be clear, I don't actually know that much, but like I'm now gonna actually play with that. That's really interesting.
I'm a sucker for like a theme in any way. Like anytime I can like try to carry a theme through something, whether it's an entire series or, my Oscars party, like whatever, like I love a good theme. So that's where my mind goes. But I can also see that as being like almost like a hindrance if it's like you convince yourself that you have to connect it to another story.
Well, sometimes, like we said, it only takes that one element. Like if there's one,
sure,
even if it's just the title or something,
yeah,
like, really lead people astray.
There you go.
But there's no teenagers or anything. Like, no. But if I figure out how to do that, it's going to be like to Kelly.
Great, I'll take it. To Kelly and John Hughes. That's it.
Exactly.
All right, Alison, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that happens like in romance, especially because so many romance series, like so many romance novels are series where it's like side characters are introduced to be future main characters. There's like always like a lot of questions about like, is this person going to get a book? Is this, can we hear more. But incidentally, like with Kiss Her Once for me, the number one thing people wanted more of in that story was like they wanted a book about the grandmas.
Yes.
So like my book, you know, features these like 82-year-old grandmas who are just like drinking the whole time, and that's their function. They're just kind of like drunk and high at this like Christmas party. And so that surprised me that everybody was like, oh, I would read like their book. Forget about the like young people that you've created, you know, forget about like
grandmas.
that. Yeah, forget about that side story. No, just like we would read about the grandmas doing whatever. So which I feel like I'm not like equipped to write like a love story about 82-year-olds.
Okay.
But I don't know. Sounds like they deserve like a little holiday short.
Yeah.
Well,
I would love to give them that.
I loved about the grandmas specifically in your book is that it wasn't even the fact that they're drunk and high grannies, which I mean, let alone is already great on its own. But I loved that they were married to the same man, that one of them was the ex-wife of grandpa and one of them was like the widowed wife of grandpa. And I that was what I loved about it, was the dynamic of, wow, here you have these two women who were married to the same man and are now like besties and like bond. That was like a dynamic unlike any that I'd read before. So that's what drew me to their story for sure.
Yeah, which is why I mean, in early drafts, because I love side romances, I always try to have like 4 too many, and my editor has to cut a bunch of them. And one of my side romances was like the grannies falling in love. And my editor had to be like, this is great, but no, you can't do that. Like you already have a like side romance. Like we need time for like the actual main romance that you're telling. So like
fair.
Control yourself. And I was like, okay, fine. No queer grannies, I guess. So I was pretty sad about that.
They're queer in our hearts.
Yeah, exactly. In my heart for sure.
Yeah.
And deeply in love.
Yeah.
It's so funny because I just rewatched While You Were Sleeping because of the rom-com bracket, because at the end of rom-com bracket, we do like a live watch where everybody is watching and tweeting about it. And what I loved, one of the things that consistently came up was the grandma in that movie. I think it's Elsie. And everybody was like, Elsie and Saul, like there was something going on there at some point. And it just led my mind down this road. I'm like, ooh, you're right. I would love to know what kind of stories the two of them have. Yeah, we love to see it. But another fan fiction for another day.
Exactly.
Well, and I think, and I know we've mentioned that sometimes it's a matter of finding a story that maybe isn't even a romance, but making it a romance. But I think pretty consistently, a lot of the retellings that we're seeing happening from fairy tales to Jane Austen to, Shakespeare, and of course, our favorite rom-com movies, I think a lot of them do pull from source material that is originally also a romantic comedy. And I think it kind of just begs the question of like, in a genre that is so built off of formula, like what is it that's so replicable, but also attractive about romantic comedies that we can like rewrite them time and time again?
I think part of it's like what Allie said too, of like, we love being able to take stories and then like put them in a modern context or just like put them into a different context that like, it's so interesting, or even with like Easy A, the way that like taking a classic story and then putting it just in a different setting and seeing the ripple effect of like how that changes things can be really fun. And so I know that's definitely, part of it for me.
And I think a lot of the times people are like just deeply fans of the stories and they just want to make it more relevant to them. And, or they want to just be inside of it. Like, let's be honest, sometimes people just want to be inside of the story themselves. And so they write a version of it where they could have someone just like themselves in it. And that, and as somebody who like, as people who enjoy romance, I'm going to assume people, despite what movies say, I assume that people who write romance enjoy reading it as well. They appreciate those beats and the stories and the formulaicness of it. Like, they love the formula because at the end you feel good, right? You get that happily ever after. It's that warm hug.
And I love what you said, because when you as a reader finish a book, I don't know about anybody else, but my first thought is, I want to do this, or I want to experience this, I want to live this, I want to go to Paris, I want whatever it is I'm reading. And the best part of writing is the writing. And I know like maybe that's not like universally believed, but for me, the best part of the experience is actually that like time when I'm so in the zone writing something and experiencing it. So when I watch or read something that's truly inspiring or fun or, swoony, I just want to live in that moment for as long as possible. It's exactly what you said. So I think people see something and they might not recognize that what's happening is like inspiration, but they know that they just want it to keep going. And so it's just somebody who's more inclined to create is like, oh, I'm going to make it. Whereas somebody who's a reader is, I'm going to go find more of it. So it's just a different response to the same feeling.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I like the way that you put that. And I think that's very true. And it's making me think too of Nisha's series that she has, and that, she very much took, we see some version of Shakespeare's comedies in almost any romantic comedy at this point. But I like that she very much was like, I would love to see, South Asian characters like in this series and go from there. And I think we see it a lot when it comes to race, when it comes to gender, when it comes to sexuality, that we are seeing a lot of these updates, and just, like Alison said, we're making them a little bit more queer. We're, putting in a cast of characters that are a little bit more representative of the world that we exist in. And I think there's something so wonderful about that. We should be doing that with all of our stories, whether or not they're original source material or, being pulled from somewhere else. But that's what we all want, I think, at the end of the day, is to see and read about people who remind us of us, our friends, our families, because if the main message is that love is available for everybody, that everybody deserves this happy ever after, then we want to see that for ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think? We've talked about a lot of like the benefits of adapting source material. What do you think? Are there any drawbacks?
Yes.
Do tell.
Yeah, I feel like one, of course, is expectations. And like Livy kind of made a joke about this where you were like, I'll use the title. And you're like, oh, I don't want to mislead anyone. But that like once your book is marked as a retelling of any kind, people go into it with certain expectations and can be disappointed, like simply because like they formed assumptions and like it doesn't live up to that. And then for me as a writer, like, it's also hard to decide, like, you are playing within like sort of somebody else's rules or somebody else's structure a little bit, and deciding like how much of that you want to keep and how much you don't. And it can be, I think, tricky in that sense.
I will say, just in terms of the titles alone, as somebody who's only published one story so far, but I love a pun and I love a punny title, I very specifically chose titles for this series that I'm writing that are all pulled from classic Christmas movies that incorporate Los Angeles locations into the title. And one of the very first things my writers group kind of gave me, just as a word of warning, was, what if people think you're recreating this movie that you're referencing, and then you go in to write it and it's not that movie? Like, do you think people will be disappointed? And I said, that's a very real assumption to make. Like, I mean, I'm going to try to preface it and say, this is not Love Actually. This is not, A Christmas Carol. But I do think as readers, we do tend to make a lot of assumptions, and that can be a hindrance to ourselves and our reading experience when we do that.
And I mean, even if we're talking about adaptations, I mean, like even with movies, people have such high expectations about what they're viewing. And I try and go into like any adaptation that I watch with the understanding that the source material still exists. It's not killing it. This is just somebody's way of interpreting it. But I mean, like, look at the reaction to the latest Persuasion adaptation. Okay. Not to stay on Persuasion so much, but the visceral reaction that a lot of people had to it, even though it did meet and qualify for all the beats of Persuasion, just because it wasn't exactly the way that somebody had read the book, because it was set in period with period dress. People had expectations that it would be something a little bit more faithful to the story, like everybody's favorite version with what's his name? Oh God, I'm blanking on his name right now. But you know, it's not particularly faithful, no, but it is a retelling of Persuasion, and it does hit all the beats. Just you don't like it.
Yeah, the thought I was having as you were talking was like, for me, it's the audacity of myself to try to. Like, I was pretty sure the minute my title was solidified that it was going to be a situation of expectations for sure.
Sure.
But one thing I noticed in the early, like right when it was first starting to like go out in the world, was thinking about audience. Like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles has a huge like following from like older men. So like it's actually maybe served me well because they're not picking up my book. So the people who would be the most mad about it are not the ones reading it. But something that was so wonderful about the original was that it was just a really good like screenplay. It was a really good film. It was applauded. It was like 100 Rotten Tomato %, whatever. So again, the audacity of me to try to even use the title. That was something I had to like reckon with and accept that like by the phrase all the feels, like, you know, I'm under like a certain age, like I'm trying my best.
Right.
But you know, and so I think actually the valley between the people who like, I mean, everybody likes it now because it's good, you know, come or like reached other audiences, but originally the people who loved it the most are probably not going to read my book. And you know what? It's for the best.
Except for my dad, apparently.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you know, except for dads like Alison and I have, who
Dads
love their rom-coms. Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
It sounds like your dad and Allison's dad need to have their own little romance book club.
I know. If only.
Romance book club redux, and it's your dad's.
Yeah.
I love that.
I don't think my dad would think really in depth, though. He'd be like, yeah, I was cute. Like, that would be it. That'd be the end.
Hang out with your dad?
Of the entire conversation. We're
That's
like,
amazing.
oh, they mentioned this place where they had a milkshake. Like, I want a milkshake. Like,
I want to read books. I want to go into a book and just be like, I really liked that croissant. I'm going to go get a croissant and then not have a single thought about anything else.
That's it.
That's the whole thing.
I will say, and this is something that, you know, especially because when I was reading Alison's book, I was so excited that it took place in Portland. Hilariously, too, also, like, part of it is, like, following this, like, epic snowstorm. And I rethought about it when we had this epic snowstorm recently in Portland, because I was like, wow, that does happen. But I do love when books will mention, like, actual places in the books, because then I want to go on like a walking tour. I want to like go visit all of these places. So I would do that. I would go get the croissant. I would go get the milkshake. Like, I would be the person who would go do that.
That's how I ended up in Forks, Washington when I was 19. So yeah.
Of course.
There you go.
Sounds right. Yeah.
There you go.
You had to.
Yes.
It had to be done.
I've been there too, I'm just saying. But well, and then the last thing that I wanted to know from each of you, and this is kind of a two-parter, and I'm going to give them both to you at once because I feel like there might be like a little bit of thought that needs to go into it. And that is there a favorite adaptation that you've read thus far? And is there one that you haven't seen yet that you would like to see? So I'll just start because like the one that I read fairly recently was Pride and Protest by Nikki Payne. And I love it. I am somebody who, as much as I love all of Jane Austen's books that I have read, I actually have like a running spreadsheet of Pride and Prejudice adaptations that go across like movies, TV shows, books. I have like a web series, a couple podcasts, like I just keep it because I'm like, someday I would love to teach a class that's just talking about adaptations of this book and how many there really are. But I loved Pride and Protest. I thought it was so great. It's very, very modern. And just the characters were great. It was also much sexier than I thought it was going to be. So that was, well, anything is sexier than the original Pride and Prejudice. But I thought that one was a lot of fun. And then as far as ones I'd love to see, you know, it's one of those things where it's like, I went to school for theater. So like, I'm very familiar with Shakespeare, and it's weird because I'm like, I kind of want to see somebody try to adapt the ones that aren't comedies, but like make them
Like
comedies?
King Lear as a comedy?
Yeah,
I'm just like, because I do think that in some of the tragedies, there are certain setups in like the family dynamics or things that are going on that I'm like, that's actually hilarious, but like it doesn't end that way. So like I do think it's there. I do think there is something to be found there. Especially if you wanted to go with like a modern royalty, a royal setting. I do think that would be kind of cool, but I'm not the one to do it. It's just wishful thinking on my part because I don't know how you go about doing it, because you would have to add in the romance and the comedy a lot of the time. So we'll see. And over to anybody else who wants to answer.
I can jump in because I have tried to outline a rom-com version of Hamlet like several times. It's like very hard.
On my mind.
I know it's weird, but like I was a high school English teacher. So like I have read Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet because like we read it aloud. Like I have read those plays like literally 50 times. And so I feel like there should be some use of that skill. Like the fact that I know those plays by heart, like I should be able to somehow like parlay that into making money. But it's incredibly difficult. So like stay tuned on that one because that play's messed up. But one of my favorite adaptations, I also loved Pride and Protest. It was so good. And I feel like there are so many Pride and Prejudice retellings, so it's kind of hard to like have a standout one. And I feel like Nikki Payne did an amazing job with that story. But another one I really love is my friend Timothy Janofsky. His next book is coming out, and it's called New Adult. And it is sort of a 13 going on 30 retelling, like, but kind of like how Livy talked about, where it takes like that nugget of like waking up and being 30, but in other ways is not very similar to 13 going on 30, but I love it. And so I highly recommend it. It comes out in August.
I will say Timothy's holiday book, You're a Mean One, Matthew Prince, is also fantastic. And I don't know if it was if there was any sort of like inspiration or source material behind that, because all I could think when I was reading it was channeling so much of like David from Schitt's Creek.
Oh, that is literally the inspiration.
Okay.
That is. Yeah. I was like,
fantastic.
Like, she's not going to think it was that, but no, that actually was. It was like
great.
Or I think I think his editor tweeted like after oh my gosh, Happiest Season came out.
Okay.
His editor tweeted like, I want Happiest Season, but from Dan Levy's perspective.
Fantastic. So just Dan Levy in general.
And just Dan Levy.
All around.
So, yeah, Timothy was like, oh, I have that. I got that. Like, I'll send it to you.
That's so good. Yeah, no, and that was that's because that's how when we did we did the 12 Days of Boobsmas and we talked about that book. I was I was like, I don't know if this is meant to be giving me like David from Schitt's Creek, but it
It
totally is. So I'm so
Yes.
glad that it came through. That's
Yes.
all I have to say
You did
about
it.
that.
You nailed it.
So good.
And I look forward to your Hamlet rom-com one day.
Thank
I'm
you.
just gonna
Someday,
put that out
someday
there.
I'll find a way for Hamlet and Horatio to be in love. Like it has to happen.
Yes.
Love that. I'm not as well versed in Shakespeare as the certainly not as Alison, who was teaching it, and but I'm not sure how much to say, but feuding families is a very near and dear thing to me, and I am
Nice.
working on something with feuding families, and so there will be no Romeo and Julieting as a verb for sure, but there will really be big, loud, chaotic families, because one movie that I love that I knew I wanted to do something with in whatever way I could was My Wedding.
Oh yeah.
I knew it from the minute you said loud families. I was like, oh, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, obviously.
It's coming. It's happening. It should be happening slowly and steadily. But I just love, like I said before, like the balance of getting characters in, but not giving them too much page time, like Alison was saying with the grandmas. Like that is my forever hill. Like I'm climbing that hill. But I just think the payoff is so rewarding when you do have those characters that feed into the romance that truly are the village, because you can always tell like when a side character is just there to be colorful side character and when their relationship really drives somebody to make decisions. And so I love thinking about that. But I did also want to say one thing I loved was Dickinson on Apple TV. Talk about taking, oh my gosh, not even story, but taking a storyteller. And that's, oh my gosh, I know it's not a lot of people maybe have Apple TV, so maybe they're not as familiar, but it's the story of Emily Dickinson with Haley Steinfeld as her, or oh my gosh. I mean, first of all, Haley, iconic. They did a little persuasion with it, right? It's a lot modernized. They're wearing period clothes, but they're like singing like Drake. It's a whole thing, but oh my gosh, it is everything to me and more. I love it so much. Everyone go out and watch Dickinson, all the seasons, but that's a great example of, I bet a lot of people didn't expect what they did with it, but it was made for me specifically, age 33. Like I'm your audience, like it's me.
It was made for lesbian English teachers as well. Yes, like I love that show.
It's like all your bases are covered.
Yeah. I love the like any of the anachronistic changes. Like I love those. Like it takes me all the way back to like Knight's Tale, because like for me that was like the first one that I saw that did something like that, where you had this kick-ass soundtrack, and it's called a Lance, hello, like but it's Canterbury Tales. Like I mean it's so, that's at least the first one that I saw that did that, and I like to think that everyone was inspired by A Knight's Tale.
I just really love that, like, the screenwriter director for that, like he gets all this power and like acclaim from writing LA Confidential, and they're like, what do you want to make? And he goes, this.
A Knight's Tale, obviously.
Like, okay.
Yep, absolutely. So how about you, Allie? Do you have any favorites or ones that you would like to see?
Oh gosh. I mean, so there is an adaptation of 10 Things I Hate About You that I actually really enjoy, by Loretta Chase, called 10 Things I Hate About the Duke. It's not an adaptation of Taming of the Shrew. It's an adaptation of 10 Things I Hate About You.
And that's there's a difference. That is good to mention.
And I really enjoyed that. So I think that's like most recently the one that I read that stands out to me. An adaptation I would want to see. Ooh, like of a classic or
of anything, really.
Of anything?
I mean,
okay.
While You Were Sleeping is a classic in my book. Like
I honestly don't know. I just always love seeing when story happens. So
I think I'm always really impressed and surprised by some of the stories that people do adapt. Like it makes sense to me to go with a rom-com. Even John Hughes like has this very specific era in the 80s that I'm like, yeah, you could just say John Hughes comedy and I'd be like, I'm right there with you. You know, Shakespeare, I get it. Jane Austen, I get it. But I feel like occasionally there's one that'll really surprise me. And I just think, I'm going to read that because if nothing else, I just want to know what rom-com Hamlet looks like. Like, you know.
So do I. I also want to know what it would look like.
Sometimes you just want to see how they do it.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's one of my favorite parts about like especially when romance like commits to being bonkers. Like you just want to be along for the ride to see how the hell do they figure this out? How do they make this work?
Yeah. And I think what's cool in the last few years is we've seen a lot more villain retelling romances. We've seen, okay, she doesn't pick the prince, she picks the monster. We've seen kind of like a different version of the side characters inserting themselves into romance novels, but a lot of the times they're the bad guys or they're the who we thought were bad guys. So I that alone has been like really fun to watch. And then you add in like the monsters and the aliens and everything, and woo, that's a whole other thing. But I love it. I love it all. So I kind of wonder like what will be next. Like if we've done, not that monsters and aliens are going away anytime soon, but if we've done our like fairy tale retellings and we've done our monsters, what comes after that? And I have no idea, but I am excited to see.
Personally, I think it's time to go back to paranormal. Bring back my vampires.
Yes. Okay.
And my shifters and like I want them to go back to that world. We're due. It's been at least a decade since they were popular.
Yeah. I think it's time. I think it's more long overdue. So I'm with you. I would be happy to see that again. So
yeah, let's get back to that time where everybody wants bite marks on their neck.
Yeah. You know what I would love to see is the blend of that, but with more comedy. I would love to see more rom-com paranormal, which
and like that had a heyday like in the early aughts, like the comedy paranormal, like before I feel like the Arjuna series has gotten a lot darker, but like in the beginning it was a very rom-commy, but with vampires.
Yeah, I think a lot of the Sookie Stackhouse series was too. The series that inspired True Blood. I think a lot of it, there was like a lot of like small town comedy energy to it. So yeah, give me comedic paranormal. I'm here for it. So, yoo-hoo. Well, ladies, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this. How about we wrap up and everybody tell the folks watching and or listening at home where they can find and follow you and keep up with what's coming up next for you.
Okay.
Anybody.
You can find me at Livy Hart Romance at 17 different social media sites, all of them. They're all the same, Livy Hart Romance. Planes, Trains, and All the Feels will be out in May. And then I have a surprise coming out in August that I haven't talked at all about. So that'll be something to look out for soon that I'll be talking about. And yeah.
All right.
You can find me on Instagram at Alison Cochrun. And I do not have a book coming out in 2023. My next rom-com will come out in spring of 24. It's called Here We Go Again. And much like Livy, it is a like road trip romance.
Woohoo!
Cool. You can find me at Allie is Writing on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. You can follow the podcast at Rom Ever After on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. I have a website, Allie K. Parker. If you go on to my Twitter, I have a pinned tweet where you can find me in all the annoying places. And I promise I'm only most annoying on Twitter, like everywhere else. Like I barely annoy you.
That's where I follow you most.
And I do plan on having some episodes come out soon. So the podcast is on all the regular spots.
Yippee. Yeah. And much like Allie's podcast, Boobies and Noobies, you can listen to wherever you stream your podcasts. I'm at Boobies Podcast across social medias and boobiesandnoobies.com. Yeah, I bet you didn't think you'd ever say the word boobies so much in your adult life, but then you start a podcast called Boobies and Noobies. But yeah, so everybody, thanks so much for tuning in to watch. And if you're listening to the podcast recording of this episode, thank you for that. And hopefully we'll be able to get Nisha Sharma here back sometime soon for round 2 when we all discuss Love is Blind season 4, obviously, as we were doing before we started recording. So next time there will be a time and a place for that. But in the meantime, thank you all again. And thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.